Thank you for tuning in to the newest episode of the Plain Bible Teaching Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Soker. This episode is being released on August 17th, 2023. And this week we're talking about the percentage of Protestant pastors who believe there is a growing sense of fear within their churches regarding the future of the nation and the future of Christianity. Well, why is that the case? What is causing churchgoers to be fearful? And is that the appropriate response to whatever is provoking that emotional reaction? Or should Christians be responding in another way? We're going to talk about that in our episode today. For links to the story we're talking about, as well as other related materials, check out the show notes for this episode at plainbibleteaching.com/podcast/081723. Now for our story this week. Fear prevalent in pews according to Protestant pastors. From Lifeway Research. A Lifeway Research study finds almost 7 in 10 U.S. Protestant pastors, 69%, believe there is a growing sense of fear within their congregations about the future of the nation and world. Additionally, more than 3 in 5, 63%, say their churches have a similar increasing dread specifically about the future of Christianity in the U.S. and around the world. Then later in the article it says this: those leading the smallest churches with fewer than 50 in attendance at weekend worship services are among the most likely to say their congregations have a growing fear about the future of the country and the world at 72%. Now, to give a disclaimer, I do not claim to be a Protestant. I am not a pastor. I preach among churches of Christ. However, that being said, there are often similarities between us and them, so that these type of statistics a lot of times reflect the condition among brethren. Not always, but often that is the case. And I think this is one instance in which there are probably a lot of similarities between what these statistics found and what generally our brethren see in our churches. Also, I read a portion of that article that talked about the percentage is even higher among smaller churches that have 50 or less in attendance. Not drastically higher, but enough that it's close to 3 in 4 of smaller churches. And as I preach for a smaller church, that certainly caught my attention. I'm sure that many of you who are listening are in similar churches that are of similar size to that. But regardless of how large or small the church is where you attend, this growing sense of fear can be a threat. So we're going to talk about a few points that are related to that today. Number 1, as Christians, we are not to live in fear. A month after the start of the pandemic, which in a lot of ways feels like a long time ago, but back in 2020, I wrote an article called Take Courage in the Face of Tribulation, and I'll link to that in the show notes. But it was based upon Jesus' words to his disciples shortly before his death in John 16, verses 32 and 33. Behold, an hour is coming, and has already come, for you to be scattered, each to his own home, and to leave me alone. And yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. These things I have spoken to you, so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage. I have overcome the world. So in telling them to take courage or to not fear, Jesus gave 3 reasons why they were able to do that. Number 1, it was because Jesus had overcome the world. He said, I have overcome the world in that passage. And he did this first by living a sinless life and never giving in to temptation. But he also did this by being raised from the dead. And that was so certain that he was able to say that he had already overcome the world, even though that had not happened yet. We know that death is a reality, but it could also come prematurely if we're targeted for our faith, which is becoming increasingly more possible even in this country. But remember what the Hebrew writer said over in Hebrews 2 verses 14 and 15. Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself, referring to Jesus, likewise also partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all of their lives. Through Christ and what he has done in going to the cross but then being raised from the dead, we do not have to fear death, even if that may be in our future. The second reason he gave was that God does not forsake his own. He said, I am not alone because the Father is with me. Now, when we think about what Jesus, some of the statements he made while he was on the cross, one of them in particular has been misinterpreted by a lot of people, where he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? When he was quoting the beginning of Psalm 22. And they take that, and rather than look at the context of Psalm 22, they just assume that that means the Father turned his back on the Son. That's not what happened. And that's not what this passage means, that he was going to be forsaken. No, God was going to be with him. And we don't have time to get into all of that here today, but for a more in-depth explanation of all of that, I'll link an article in the show notes that talks about that. It's titled, my God, why have you forsaken me? Where he's quoting from Psalm 22 and making the point that while it looks like he was forsaken, God the Father never turned his back on him, which reinforces his point here. God does not forsake his own. And the third reason why his disciples could take courage is because tribulation is only of this world. He said, in the world you have tribulation. Once his work on earth was finished, Jesus was going to return to heaven where there would be none of the pain and suffering that we experience here in this life. At the end of last week's episode, I briefly mentioned Paul's statement in 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 17 that talks about how the troubles that we experience in life are only momentary light affliction. Let's notice that passage in its context, beginning in verse 16 of 2 Corinthians 4. Therefore we do not lose heart, but though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory, far beyond all comparison, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. For we know that if the earthly tent which is our house is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. These 3 points that Jesus made here to his disciples are the ones we need to remember also at all times, because we are going to experience troubles throughout our life. We need to remember, number 1, Jesus overcame the world. Number 2, God does not forsake his own. And number 3, any trouble, any tribulation is only of this world. Therefore, Christians are not to live in fear. But the second point that I want us to notice on this idea about this growing sense of fear is that there are reasons why people would be fearful. We won't spend a lot of time looking at these, but as you think about the things that are going on in the world around us, the things that you can read about or see in the news, where you have economic uncertainty, you have political turmoil, you have concerns over government corruption, you have threats of violence in different places, there are health concerns that people have, and all sorts of different things. There are reasons why people might be fearful about what could be coming in the future. But just because there are reasons for that does not mean we let that take over us. So the third point that I want us to think about today is that we need to act with wisdom. Notice what Jesus told his disciples in Matthew 10 and verse 16. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. This was said before he sent his disciples out to preach. But the same general application can be made for any of the Lord's disciples living at any point in history, including us today. we are not to be naive, because there will always be wolves, as he described them in that passage. There will always be wolves out there who seek to do us harm. So we are to act with wisdom. Well, what does that mean, to act with wisdom? Notice what the wise man said in Proverbs 27 and verse 12. He said, "A prudent man sees evil and hides himself. The naive proceed and pay the penalty." That hiding that the wise man talked about there was not done out of fear, but out of wisdom. He was protecting himself rather than naively walking into trouble unnecessarily. So we don't live in fear, but we do recognize there could be dangers and there could be threats and there could be all these things around us. So we act with wisdom. If we can protect ourselves, that's what we're going to do. If we can avoid trouble, that's what we're going to try to do. If we can't, well, then we still act with faith. We take courage and we deal with whatever is going to face us. But we can act with wisdom, and there may be times where we can hide ourselves from trouble and avoid some of the negative consequences that could come against us if we just ignored these realities and just blindly walked into them. But the last point I want us to talk about here today is that we have to live by faith and not by fear. We have to trust in God regardless of the troubles and the uncertainties of this life. What does that look like? To trust in God regardless of what might be coming in the future. One of my favorite passages in the Bible that describes God's providence is Proverbs 27, verses 23 through 27, where it says, "Know well the condition of your flocks, and pay attention to your herds. For riches are not forever, nor does a crown endure to all generations. When the grass disappears, the new growth is seen, and the herbs of the mountains are gathered in. The lambs will be for your clothing, and the goats will bring the price of a field. There will be goat's milk enough for your food, and the food of your household, and sustenance for your maidens." We don't have time here to go into an in-depth study of that passage, but I will link to an article that I wrote that we do go into that in more detail. That's titled, "Know Well the Condition of Your Flocks." That will be linked in the show notes. If you haven't read that, I would encourage you to go ahead and read that. As I said, that's probably my favorite passage that talks about the providence of God, and you can read about why that would be the case in that article. But the wise man there in that passage talked about economic uncertainty. He said, riches are not forever. You might have them now, but we don't know how long they're going to last. We don't know what turn could happen in the future. And he talked about political uncertainty. He said, a crown does not endure to all generations. Yet by acting with wisdom and by working hard, by exercising good stewardship, and, which is implied in the passage, putting our trust and faith in God, we can get through tough times that come through those uncertainties. So there are a lot of people in the world around us living in fear for a number of reasons. Even among Christians, there's a temptation to allow the worries of this life to overcome us and distract us from the blessings and promises that we have from God. So let us not forget what Jesus said. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage. I have overcome the world. That's all for this week. Thank you for listening to the Plain Bible Teaching Podcast. I hope you found this to be interesting, informative, and helpful. For links to the story we talked about, as well as other related materials, visit the show notes for this episode at plainbibleteaching.com/podcast/081723. If you have a moment to rate and review the podcast or share it with others that would be interested in this, that is always appreciated. And if you're listening to this, remember that we are also uploading video versions of the podcast to the Plain Bible Teaching YouTube channel. So those are available there along with other videos that we post. So if you're watching this, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can see those other videos that we post here from time to time. And if you see a news story or have some topic that you think would make for a good discussion, please send that to me at andy@plainbibleteaching.com. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to talk to you again next week.